Welcome to Dark Reality Stories. Today, we're stepping into one of the most powerful and overlooked courtroom battles in American history, the true story of Sojourner Truth, a mother who refused to accept injustice and took the American court's head on to save her child. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your country, anywhere in the world, and if you value deeply researched, fact-checked stories like this, please subscribe. Every video here takes long hours of digging through real historical records to bring you truth, not myths, and your support keeps these stories alive. Sojourner Truth was born around 1797 into slavery in Ulster County, New York, a fact that surprises many who assume slavery existed only in the American South. At birth, she was given the name Isabella Bomfrey, a name chosen not by her mother, but by the system that claimed ownership over her life. She entered the world already considered property, her value measured not in humanity, but in labor, strength, and future profit for enslavers. Her parents, James and Elizabeth Bomfrey, were both enslaved Africans who had endured brutal physical punishment and psychological control. From them, Isabella learned early that survival required silence, obedience, and resilience. Their stories of beatings, whippings, and family separations were not warnings of a distant threat, they were a preview of the life awaiting her. Slavery was not an abstract condition. It was the air she breathed from her first days. Unlike many enslaved people in America, Isabella grew up speaking Dutch, not English, because her enslavers were Dutch settlers. This language barrier would later deepen her isolation, making her more vulnerable to abuse and manipulation. Even as a child, she struggled to understand orders, punishments, and threats spoken in a language that was not hers, reinforcing how completely powerless she was within the system. As a young girl, she was sold multiple times, treated as a transferable object rather than a human being. Each sale tore her away from familiar faces, safety, and any fragile sense of belonging. These early separations planted a deep trauma that would later fuel her fierce resistance to the forced destruction of black families under slavery. Loss became a constant companion long before she reached adulthood. Violence shaped her childhood. Isabella endured harsh physical punishment, often for reasons she could not understand, especially when language failed her. Beatings were used not only to control her body, but to crush her spirit. Yet even then, witnesses later recalled her unusual physical strength and quiet defiance, traits that hinted at the woman she would become. Religion entered her life early, not through formal teaching, but through whispered prayers and private conversations with God. In the absence of protection from people, she turned inward, developing a spiritual resolve that gave her a sense of worth beyond what enslavers assigned her. This inner faith would later become central to her identity as Sojourner Truth. Her birth into slavery did more than determine her legal status. It forged the foundation of her lifelong fight against injustice. Every courtroom stand, every speech, and every act of resistance traced back to those first years of being owned, sold, beaten, and silenced. From the moment she was born enslaved, the battle for her freedom and the freedom of her children had already begun. From the earliest days of slavery, the separation of enslaved families was not an accident, it was a deliberate weapon. Enslavers understood that breaking family bonds made people easier to control, and children were often used as leverage to force obedience. For Sojourner Truth, this cruelty was not something she merely witnessed. It shaped her emotional world from childhood and taught her that love itself could be taken away without warning. As a young girl, Isabella Bomfrey saw families torn apart at auctions and private sales, where human beings were lined up and priced like livestock. Mothers screamed, fathers were restrained, and children were dragged away, sometimes never to be seen again. These scenes were meant to crush hope. They taught enslaved people that no bond, not marriage, not parenthood, not blood, was safe under slavery. Within her own family, the threat of separation was constant. Her parents lived with the knowledge that any day one of their children could be sold to settle a debt or increase profit. This fear hung over every moment of family life, turning love into something fragile and temporary. Even when families remained together, they lived under the shadow of loss. As Isabella grew older, she experienced this violence personally. She was sold away from her parents while still young, severing the strongest emotional ties she had known. There were no goodbyes, no explanations, only the sudden realization that her family was gone, and she was alone among strangers who owned her body and her time. This forced separation did lasting damage. Enslaved children like Isabella learned to suppress grief because mourning openly could invite punishment. Emotional survival required endurance, silence, and the painful acceptance that attachment could be dangerous. Yet this suppression did not erase love. It buried it, waiting to resurface later as rage, sorrow, and resistance. When Isabella became a mother herself, the trauma returned with brutal force. The memory of her own childhood separations made the threat against her children unbearable. She understood, more clearly than most, that slavery did not just exploit labor. It systematically destroyed families, generation after generation. This history of stolen children and broken families explains why Sojourner Truth's later fight for her son was so extraordinary. She was not acting only as a mother in the moment, but as a woman carrying the accumulated pain of countless forced separations. When she challenged the American courts, she was confronting a system that had treated black families as disposable from the very beginning. The illegal sale of Sojourner Truth's son was the moment when personal suffering collided directly with the law. After years of enslavement, Isabella Baumfree had finally escaped slavery in New York, believing that the state's gradual emancipation laws offered some protection to her children. Her son, Peter, still a small boy, was legally not supposed to be sold out of state. But legality meant nothing to enslavers driven by profit. One morning, she learned the unthinkable. Peter had been sold by her former enslaver and secretly transported to Alabama. This was not just cruel, it was a clear violation of New York law, which prohibited the sale of enslaved children to states where slavery remained permanent. The act was deliberate and calculated, designed to erase any chance of the child ever returning. For Isabella, the news was devastating. The memory of her own childhood separations flooded back, but this time she was a mother watching history repeat itself through her son. She imagined Peter alone, frightened, surrounded by strangers, stripped of language, safety, and protection, just as she once had been. The emotional weight of that realization nearly broke her. At the time, black women had no legal power, no recognized authority, and no expectation of justice from white institutions. The courts were dominated by white men who rarely acknowledged black humanity, let alone the rights of a formerly enslaved woman. Isabella was expected to accept the loss in silence, as countless mothers before her had done. But something shifted. This was no longer only about survival, it was about truth, law, and moral defiance. Isabella understood, perhaps instinctively, that the sale was illegal. Even if the system hoped she would never challenge it. Her refusal to accept this injustice marked a radical break from what slavery demanded: submission. She began speaking openly about what had been done, naming the crime rather than internalizing the shame. Each word was dangerous. Each accusation carried risk, yet she persisted, fueled by the knowledge that silence would guarantee her son's disappearance forever. The illegal sale of Peter became the turning point that transformed Isabella Bomfrey into a force the system did not expect. What was meant to erase her child instead ignited a historic confrontation, one that would soon carry her into an American courtroom and change the course of her life forever. New York's gradual emancipation law was often presented as a moral step toward freedom, but in reality it was filled with loopholes that continued to protect enslavers more than the enslaved. Passed in stages beginning in 1799, the law did not immediately free enslaved people. Instead, it created a slow, controlled transition that allowed slavery to survive quietly for decades, especially harming black children and mothers like Sojourner Truth. Under this law, children born to enslaved women after July 4, 1799 were technically considered free, but only after serving long periods of forced labor. Boys were bound until their mid-20s, girls until their early 20s. Until then, they remained under the control of enslavers, treated no differently from slaves in daily life. Freedom existed on paper, not in reality. By 1817, New York passed another law declaring that enslaved people would be fully freed by 1827. This created hope among black families, but it also triggered panic among enslavers. Many rushed to exploit the remaining years by selling children south, where slavery was permanent and brutal. These sales were illegal, but enforcement was weak and punishment was rare. Sojourner Truth believed this law protected her son Peter. According to New York statutes, he could not legally be sold out of state. The law was clear enough on paper, but clarity meant nothing without power. Enslavers knew that poor black women had almost no means to challenge violations, and they relied on fear and isolation to keep them silent. The gradual emancipation law exposed a painful truth: freedom delayed is freedom denied. It allowed politicians to claim moral progress while permitting families to be torn apart in the final moments of legal slavery. Children, like Peter, became targets. Their future freedom turned into a financial opportunity for those who still owned them. What made Sojourner Truth's case extraordinary was her understanding of this law. Despite having no formal education, she grasped that the sale of her son was illegal, not just immoral. This awareness became her weapon. The law that was meant to quietly fade slavery instead gave her the legal ground she needed to fight back. New York's gradual emancipation law did not end slavery cleanly, but in one rare, powerful moment, it was forced to work as intended. When Sojourner Truth stepped forward to challenge its violation, she turned a flawed law into a living act of justice, proving that even weak protections could become powerful in the hands of someone brave enough to demand the truth. Walking into an American courtroom as a black woman in the early 1800s was an act of defiance in itself. These spaces were designed to white male authority, not to hear the pain of formerly enslaved people. When Sojourner Truth stepped toward the legal system, she entered a world that had never imagined someone like her demanding justice, much less expecting to receive it. At that time, black people were rarely allowed to testify against white individuals, and black women were viewed as legally invisible. Their voices were dismissed as emotional, unreliable, or irrelevant. The idea that a black mother could accuse a white man of breaking the law and expect the court to listen was almost unthinkable. The system relied on silence, not participation, from people like her. Sojourner Truth had no formal education, no legal training, and no social standing. She could not read or write fluently, and she spoke with a strong accent shaped by her Dutch, speaking childhood. Everything about her marked her as an outsider in a courtroom built on rigid class and racial hierarchies. The physical presence alone would have unsettled the room. A tall, strong black woman standing upright among seated white men challenged the unspoken rules of power. She was not bowed, not begging, not apologizing for her existence. Her posture itself was a statement. She belonged there because truth belonged there. Many expected her to be intimidated, to retreat under scrutiny or mockery. Courtrooms were hostile environments even for white women, and for a black woman they could be openly cruel. Every glance, every whisper, every procedural barrier was meant to remind her that she was not welcome. Yet she spoke plainly and directly, refusing to soften her demand. She did not frame her case as a plea for mercy, but as a matter of law. This was a critical shift. She was not asking for kindness, she was insisting on justice, and that distinction forced the court to confront her as a legal actor rather than a victim. By entering that courtroom, Sojourner Truth shattered an unspoken boundary. She proved that black women were not just subjects of the law, but could be challengers of it. Long before her famous speeches and national recognition, this moment marked her first public stand against a system that never expected her to fight back, and certainly never expected her to win. Sojourner Truth entered her legal battle without a lawyer, without money, and without anyone assigned to protect her interests. In an era when even white men struggled to navigate the legal system, a formerly enslaved black woman standing alone was almost unheard of. The absence of legal representation was not a choice. It was a reflection of a society that offered black women no access to professional defense or advocacy. At the time, lawyers were expensive and deeply connected to networks of power that excluded people like her. Most would not represent a black woman against a white man, especially in a case involving slavery and property. The law itself treated enslaved people as objects, not rights, bearing individuals, making her very claim feel dangerous to the system. Without a lawyer, Sojourner Truth had to rely on memory, spoken testimony, and her understanding of the law as she had heard it discussed. She could not submit written arguments or cite statutes in formal language. Instead, she used clarity, repetition, and moral certainty to communicate what had been done to her son and why it violated New York law. There was also no physical protection. Courtrooms were hostile spaces, and black women had no guarantee of safety when accusing white men. She risked harassment, retaliation, or worse, simply by speaking publicly. Each step forward required courage, not just to argue a case, but to survive the consequences of challenging authority. The lack of protection extended beyond the courtroom. There were no social institutions ready to support her if she failed. Losing the case could mean permanent separation from her child, public humiliation, and possibly economic ruin. The stakes were total, and there was no safety net beneath her. Yet this isolation sharpened her resolve. Without intermediaries, her voice carried raw truth. She spoke as a mother, not as a client, and that authenticity made her argument impossible to ignore. Her presence forced the court to confront the human cost. Behind abstract legal language, standing alone, unprotected and unrepresented, Sojourner Truth embodied a radical idea that justice does not require permission. Her case proved that even without lawyers or power, truth could still challenge the law and sometimes, against all odds, prevail. When Sojourner Truth spoke in court, she did not cloak her words in politeness or fear. She spoke plainly, naming what had been done to her son as a crime, not a misunderstanding. In a system built to intimidate, her refusal to soften the truth was itself a form of resistance. She understood that silence would protect the guilty, not her child. Speaking without fear did not mean she felt no fear. It meant she did not allow fear to control her voice. Every sentence carried risk. A black woman accusing a white man could be mocked, dismissed, or punished. Yet she chose clarity over safety, knowing that hesitation could be used to undermine her credibility. Her speech was direct and grounded in lived experience. She did not rely on legal jargon or emotional pleading. Instead, she repeated the central truth: her son had been illegally sold. This repetition mattered. In a courtroom used to complicated language, her simplicity cut through evasion and forced attention on the core violation. Observers are struck by her confidence. She did not bow her head or shrink under questioning. Her posture and tone communicated certainty, as if she were reminding the court of its own laws. This confidence unsettled expectations, because enslaved and formerly enslaved people were expected to be submissive, not assertive. She also refused to accept humiliation. If interrupted or challenged, she persisted. If dismissed, she returned. Her voice carried the weight of generations of silence being broken all at once. She was not only speaking for herself, but for every mother who had been forced to watch her child disappear without recourse. In speaking truth without fear, Sojourner Truth transformed the courtroom dynamic. She shifted the focus from her status to the legality of the act. The question was no longer who she was, but whether the law had been broken, and the answer became impossible to avoid. This fearless speech marked the beginning of her public identity as a truth teller. Long before she became known for powerful speeches on abolition and women's rights, she proved that speaking plainly in the face of power could change outcomes. Her voice, once expected to remain silent, became the instrument that brought her son one step closer to freedom. The courtroom was not a neutral space for Sojourner Truth. It was charged with resistance the moment she entered. Whispers followed her presence, and skeptical glances questioned her right to even stand there. Many in the room viewed her not as a grieving mother or a citizen seeking justice, but as an interruption to the normal order of things. Ridicule was subtle but constant. Her speech, shaped by years of speaking Dutch before English, was treated by some as a sign of ignorance rather than experience. Any hesitation in her words was seized upon as proof that she did not understand the law, even though the facts of the case were painfully clear. Procedural barriers were used as quiet weapons. Legal technicalities, delays, and dismissive attitudes attempted to exhaust her resolve. The system relied on the assumption that a black woman would eventually give up, overwhelmed by complexity and hostility. Persistence was not expected of her. Some questioned her credibility outright. The idea that a formerly enslaved woman could accurately recall dates, names, and events was openly doubted. Meanwhile, the word of white men involved in the sale was treated as inherently trustworthy, revealing how deeply racial bias shaped the pursuit of truth. Despite this, Sojourner Truth remained steady. Each attempt to minimize her was met with repetition of the facts. She did not engage in arguments over her worth or intelligence. She redirected attention back to the illegal sale, refusing to let the court hide behind prejudice. Her endurance slowly shifted the atmosphere. Resistance lost its effectiveness when she did not react as expected. Ridicule failed when she did not internalize it. The longer she stood firm, the harder it became for the court to dismiss her without exposing its own injustice. By surviving courtroom resistance and ridicule, Sojourner Truth demonstrated that dignity itself could be a weapon. The system tried to break her resolve through humiliation, but instead revealed its own moral weakness. What was meant to silence her only strengthened the power of her truth. The court's decision marked a moment that few believed possible. Against every expectation, the judge ruled that the sale of Sojourner Truth's son was illegal under New York law. In a legal system designed to favor white men and property owners, the court acknowledged that a black mother's claim was valid and that the law had been broken. This ruling was extraordinary because it directly challenged the assumed invincibility of enslavers. The court ordered that her son be located and returned from Alabama, a southern state where slavery was deeply entrenched. This meant crossing state lines, confronting slave traders, and admitting that New York's laws carried real authority, not just symbolic promises. For the first time, the American legal system was forced to act on behalf of a black woman against white men in a slavery-related case. The victory was not just personal. It exposed a crack in the structure of racial power. The law, when pushed hard enough, had been compelled to recognize black motherhood as something worth protecting. The ruling also carried enormous risk for those enforcing it. Retrieving a child from the Deep South challenged the economic interests of slaveholders who expected no interference. That the court followed through made the decision even more remarkable, proving this was not an empty judgment, but an enforceable one. When her son was finally brought back, the victory became tangible. This was not a symbolic win or a moral consolation. It was a living child returned to his mother's arms. In a nation built on stolen labor and stolen children, this reunion stood as a rare reversal of slavery's cruelty. The historic legal victory sent quiet shockwaves through black communities. Word spread that a black woman had stood alone in court and won. For many, it planted a dangerous but powerful idea that the courts, though hostile, could sometimes be challenged rather than feared. This moment reshaped Sojourner Truth's understanding of justice. She had seen the law used as a weapon against her people, but now she had also seen it bend under truth and persistence. The victory did not end slavery, but it proved that resistance, even from the most unlikely voice, could force history to change direction. The reunion between Sojourner Truth and her son was not gentle or celebratory in the way freedom stories are often imagined. It was heavy with emotion, marked by relief, shock, and the scars of separation that could not simply disappear. When Peter was finally returned, he was not the same child who had been taken. Slavery had already left its mark. Years of forced labor and harsh discipline in the South had changed him. He was quieter, more guarded, and visibly traumatized. For Sojourner Truth, joy was inseparable from grief. She had won her case, but the cost of that illegal sale was written on her son's body and spirit. Holding him again confirmed what she had always known: slavery did not only steal time, it reshaped lives. The reunion was proof of victory, but also a reminder of what nearly had been lost forever. Every moment with her son felt fragile, as if history itself might try to reclaim him. Sojourner Truth did not treat the reunion as a private triumph. She spoke openly about what had been done to Peter, refusing to let the damage be hidden. By telling his story, she made the consequences of slavery visible to those who preferred to discuss it in abstract terms. Caring for her son also deepened her sense of responsibility beyond motherhood. She understood that countless other children were still lost, still trapped, still legally erased. Reuniting with Peter strengthened her resolve to fight not only for herself, but for others who had no voice and no courtroom victory waiting for them. The reunion reinforced her belief that action mattered. Faith alone had not brought her son back. Courage, persistence, and confrontation with power had. This realization would shape the rest of her life, pushing her toward public speaking and activism rather than quiet survival. Reuniting with her son was both an ending and a beginning. It closed one chapter of suffering, but opened another of purpose. From that moment on, Sojourner Truth carried her victory as proof that injustice could be challenged, and that a single mother's fight could echo far beyond her own family. Sojourner Truth's courtroom victory did more than reunite a mother and her child. It altered the landscape of Black legal history. At a time when Black people were largely excluded from legal recognition, her case stood as proof that the law could be confronted by those it was designed to ignore. It became one of the earliest recorded instances of a Black woman successfully using the American legal system to assert her rights. This moment challenged the assumption that Black voices had no place in courtrooms. Until then, the legal system functioned almost entirely as a tool of control over Black bodies and labor. Truth's case disrupted that pattern by forcing the courts to acknowledge a Black woman as a legal actor rather than an object of law. The significance of her victory extended beyond slavery itself. It set a precedent, informal but powerful, that Black people could use legal knowledge and persistence as weapons against injustice. Even though the law remained deeply racist, her success revealed that it was not completely unbreakable. For Black women in particular, the impact was profound. Society denied them protection, credibility, and authority, yet Sojourner Truth demonstrated that motherhood and moral certainty could challenge legal power. She stood at the intersection of race and gender, confronting both forms of exclusion at once. Her case also influenced how abolitionists framed their arguments. It provided a real, documented example of slavery violating its own legal boundaries. This helped expose the hypocrisy of a nation that claimed to follow the rule of law while routinely breaking it to sustain human bondage. Over time, her courtroom stand became part of a broader tradition of Black legal resistance, echoed later in freedom suits, civil rights cases, and constitutional challenges. While few at the time understood its full importance, history would recognize it as an early spark in a long legal struggle for equality. The impact on Black legal history lies not just in the victory itself, but in the courage it represented. Sojourner Truth proved that the law could be confronted from the margins, and that, even in a system built to deny justice, truth could still carve a path forward. Sojourner Truth's courtroom victory did more than reunite a mother with her child. It carved a lasting mark into Black legal history. At a time when the law overwhelmingly functioned to control silence and punish Black lives, her success stood as a rare reversal of power. It showed that the legal system, though deeply biased, was not entirely immune to challenge. Her case shattered the belief that Black people, especially Black women, had no standing before the law. Courts were spaces where Black voices were usually dismissed or barred altogether. By being heard and believed, Sojourner Truth forced the system to recognize a Black woman not as property, but as a legal claimant with rights worth enforcing. This victory became an early example of legal resistance. Long before organized civil rights movements, her case demonstrated that understanding the law and refusing to be intimidated by it could expose its contradictions. She proved that the same laws used to justify oppression could sometimes be turned against it. For Black women, the impact was especially powerful. They lived at the intersection of racial and gender oppression, rarely acknowledged as credible witnesses or legitimate mothers. Sojourner Truth's case challenged those assumptions, asserting Black motherhood as something the law could not simply erase. Abolitionists later drew strength from her story. It provided concrete evidence that slavery routinely violated its own legal limits, revealing the hypocrisy of a nation claiming justice while denying humanity. Her victory became a living argument against the moral and legal foundations of slavery. Her courtroom stand also echoed into future generations. Freedom suits, civil rights litigation, and legal challenges against segregation all followed the path she helped open, using the law itself as a battlefield, while her name would later become famous for speeches and activism. This legal victory was one of her earliest acts of national significance. The true impact on Black legal history lies in what she proved possible. Sojourner Truth showed that courage, persistence, and truth could force recognition even from a hostile system. Her case did not dismantle injustice, but it cracked the foundation, and history never stopped pressing on that fracture. Sojourner Truth's legacy is rooted not only in what she endured, but in how she transformed suffering into purpose. Her courtroom victory and reunion with her son became the moral foundation of her life's work, shaping her belief that truth must be spoken aloud, especially in spaces built to silence it. From that point forward, she no longer fought only for survival, she fought for justice. After reclaiming her son, she took a new name, Sojourner Truth. It was not symbolic poetry, but a declaration of mission. Sojourner reflected her life of movement and struggle, and truth defined her purpose to confront lies with lived reality. Her name itself became a challenge to a nation built on contradictions. She carried her courtroom experience into public life, becoming a powerful speaker for abolition and women's rights. When she stood before crowds, she spoke with the authority of someone who had faced the system directly and won. Her words were not theoretical, they were grounded in blood, loss, and law. Her legacy reshaped how resistance looked. She proved that strength did not require education, wealth, or institutional backing. It required clarity, courage, and persistence. This redefinition of power inspired countless others who believed they were too marginalized to fight back. Sojourner Truth also changed how history remembers Black women. Rather than passive victims of injustice, she stood as an active architect of change. Her life challenged narratives that erased Black women's leadership in both legal and social struggles. Generations later, her story continues to echo in courtrooms, classrooms, and movements for justice. Every fight for family reunification, civil rights, and equal protection under the law carries traces of her courage. She became a symbol of what it means to confront power with truth. Her legacy of courage and justice is not confined to the past. It is a living challenge, asking each generation whether they will accept injustice or speak against it. Sojourner Truth answered that question with her life, and the world has been listening ever since.